Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've had a wonderful week so far. And given this is a Game Week 8 specific video, the international break really is over. As you will have seen with the thumbnail and the graphic in front of you, there are new graphics and we have gone for a new style of branding. And you'll see that throughout the videos with all the customized graphics. Please do let me know what you think. I am very, very open to your thoughts because after all, they are for you. Today, we cover a variety of topics, including Cole Palmer, Phil Foden, Spurs assets in quite a bit of depth, captaincy, could I do it yet again? Well, you'll find out, and a variety of other important things to discuss. If you haven't subscribed already, please do consider clicking the button. The graphics are done, the rank is good, and many of you watch anyway and still haven't subscribed, so you may as well click the button. But without anything else needing to be said, let's hop into the video. Right, so this is your introduction to the new graphics. I hope you like it, and again, tell me what you think. I have started to become more and more interested with Spurs as their attack sustains some good form and the fixture run is so attractive. This group of 4 fixtures in particular, considering as well it ends in Game Week 12 where you can go off them, is a really nice set in which I think you could exploit. Now let's go through them one by one and essentially understand why. West Ham have shown a susceptibility to being poorer defensively in games which are played at a faster pace, and this is predominantly, in my opinion, due to their midfield composition and how its ability to withstand teams that can transition really well, it just isn't really there in the capacity needed. When you play against Spurs, you almost have no decision but to play in a very basketball-like game, thus inviting transitions. You know they're going to overload you in your own third to an extent, right? With the fullbacks pushing on, and more so now with even if Poro's a little bit deeper, you still got Kulusevski in that space operating something different to what the right 8 did previously, and you've obviously got Udogie making those advancements as well. And it's not like when Kulusevski goes, Maddison necessarily stays. They're both willing to advance. Sometimes Maddison will drop deeper into that left half space to facilitate the left winger in a better manner, right, when Udogie is a little bit deeper. But nonetheless, there is always that numeric overload, particularly when the ball is on one side. And therefore, West Ham don't really have a choice but to indulge in a game which is of a faster pace. And for all of those reasons, I think, again, there could be goals for Spurs. And I like the fact that 3 out of the next 4 fixtures are at home. I think Palace's big problem is their pivot. I wasn't a huge fan of their pressing against Liverpool, albeit Liverpool are a completely different side to Spurs and they have different qualities. So whilst I don't think the press will be as much of an issue, I do think that if their pivot is given this level of responsibility and continues to perform in this way, which I don't really blame them for too much considering what they're being asked to do, again, I think Spurs could really profit as a result. Villa is definitely the hardest fixture of the lot, right? My thinking, however, is, and I did tweet this during the Everton game when Villa played Everton, I have watched their centre-backs struggle at times against very physically dominant centre-forwards, and all you have to do is watch the first 15 seconds of the Spurs-Arsenal game, and you'll see where Saliba and Solanke go shoulder to shoulder, or at least he backs into him, and you'll see how strong Solanke was and how much of a handful he was to deal with. And I think this is a way that Solanke could exploit them. The other thing is, could Spurs turn them over high? Well, they like this, they're slow build up now, right? And Spurs are decent in that sense of being able to nick the ball back high up the pitch. And as a result, could you isolate their fullbacks who are both not the best 1v1 defensively? And the other thing is, Andrew wingers are traditionally quite wide, right? Let's just assume it will almost definitely be Son by that time and Johnson. And with Villa's build-up structure, allowing the left back to advance and then almost forming a back 3, I think definitely counter-attacking football or transition-based football, or even just very quick build-up, there's definitely space to exploit there and an opportunity to exploit there. So for all of those reasons, I think Spurs could have a decent time in terms of their attacking sense against Villa as well. And then Ipswich obviously is the best fixture of the lot, especially if they try and play a more possession-based game model, similar to what Southampton have done at some of the big sides like Arsenal. I think that could be a pretty difficult task for them. And they seem a lot more defensively susceptible to conceding big chances away from home compared to at home. So with that in mind, all 4 fixtures have something from a, I guess, tactical perspective whereby Spurs can exploit them and their attacking assets can do well. I'm not really too bothered about going the other way, right? Because this Spurs side will score goals, and that's what we're here to get, right? Points from their attacking assets. Moving on to which players you should buy, because that then becomes the big question. I think against West Ham and Palace, the more central players have an advantage for the reasons I've discussed, primarily the pivot, alongside the Palace press, which you can bypass the second way fairly easily if you have someone that's good at receiving and turning in your 6. And Bentancur certainly is decent, at least at receiving. And if Kulusevski and Maddison are to rotate and drop in like they did against United, I think that would definitely cause Palace's press problems as well, just being able to offset that ball continuously, given that they're quite aggressive and there's less of blocking passing lanes and more going man-to-man with the centre-back. So I think for those reasons, you can the central players who will have a lot of the ball, and where Palace don't really offer you too much in the wide areas. For example, you watched the game against Liverpool, right? And Salah wasn't massively involved. Gakpo wasn't hugely involved. And certainly there wasn't exactly a high volume of opportunities for them to do so because of the wing-back system they play. So I really do favour the central players. And it's why pretty much, and West Ham, obviously, I spoke about their game model and being too susceptible. It's just been playing through in the centre, which I've talked about a lot this season, all the way from game week 1. And for those reasons, alongside the fact that he has the fundamentals as well to go with and the price, and the fact that the AND system is designed for the number 9 to profit, I think Solanke for me is still the best Spurs asset. I do, however, prefer Maddison and Kulusevski for that West Ham and Palace fixture, and I think Villa and Ipswich is slightly more neutral as a result of the way they play. I think everyone there can have a little bit more. Talking about the other 4, Solanke aside, because I've already established I quite like him. I do think that the ceiling is maybe missing a little bit, purely because on an individual level that he doesn't seem to be as tenacious as he was at Bournemouth. I think he's still settling in, whether it be the system or handling a little niggle he has from his injury. One of those things. Primarily the reason why he hasn't looked as sharp, but I'm sure, especially with the international break now and a lower intensity of football, given he exactly have a lot of minutes, I think he's slowly getting there, and the fact that he's actually getting returns now. In terms of the other 4, look, Son is great, but he's expensive, and you can justify him as an asset even though he is shackled to the touchline, because he'll get quite a decent number of points regardless, right? But when he's at that price and you have the opportunity cost of the likes of Foden in the short term and then Saka and Palmer, can you really justify it? And for me, no. Until you see a shift in the left-hand side dynamics, just like we saw on the right, I just don't think you can realistically go Son without accepting at least that there's a lot of risk attached to it. Maddison, I like more and more. He's a player I used to like a lot in FPL, but as a goal threat went down slightly, I started to distance myself from him. I think if you're willing to pay that type of money, then fair enough. I'm pretty 50-50 on it, so I can't give you a conclusive judgment. I like it more than I originally did. Kulusevski is great, apart from the fact he's not a killer, right? Because you've got the 90 minutes there. You've got the brilliant price there. But he's just, in terms of output, he's just not a killer. So if you're willing to, again, accept that risk, I wouldn't mind going that. From before, I was higher on Kulusevski than I was on Maddison, but I prefer Maddison's chance of at least scoring a goal or even getting an assist through his final pass. So I'd probably have him at second, Solanke at first, him at second. With Brennan Johnson, I think it's really tough because you look at a right winger in an AND system and it's not the most optimal setup for a winger to thrive, at least in terms of output. But then you look at his goal scoring form. I really like him as a player, and that kind of balances things out, as well as the expected minutes improving. I know people talk about Richarlison coming back and Son coming back and Odegaard coming back, but I don't really think anyone or any of them are really primed to play that right wing spot. I don't really like Kulusevski there either. So I think Ange has started to revert away from that. And as a result, I think his minutes will be pretty good. So I'm higher on him and Maddison than I was initially. Probably lower than I was on Kulusevski. And I do now think that you genuinely can go here, and I can have no quarrels about it because the fixtures are good. They're in good form, and they're playing well as a team, and the prices aren't exactly extortionate, Son aside. I wonder how long it's going to be before I don't have to talk about Cole Palmer or give him his own section in a game week. Okay, this isn't the easiest one again, but this one I have far more of a conclusive judgment to give. I don't like it. There's a quote there, which is when everyone is buying, and you know the Warren Buffett quote, and when there's blood in the streets, that's when you should buy. Now that always has to be applied with context because it's not always going to be true. For example, if everyone's buying Erling Haaland after game week 2, well, that makes sense because then he goes and slaps a hat-trick next game, right? But you get the sentiment at the point. The fixtures are really, really, really poor. And I think they're being underestimated just how poor they are. You look at Liverpool, and this is not a Jurgen Klopp Liverpool. And like at Anfield is not easy. As it never has been. And I just wanted to reiterate that. But you look at the fact that you've got a very well-stationed, disciplined, intelligent, well-coached double pivot in front of the centre-backs, right? Which means that they don't have to step up too much to cover too much space. And the line isn't ridiculously high compared to what it was with Klopp. It's still relatively high, but it provides them some security as well, especially when you consider the fullbacks are fairly narrow. And my point being that they just don't get dragged too much. And considering both of them are physical monsters in Konate and Van Dijk, it's going to be very difficult to displace them positionally and catch them out. And then even if you do, they still have a brilliant chance in terms of their recovery because of their defensive and physical traits. So that's something to consider in terms of Chelsea's overall chances at Anfield, in terms of how likely they are to sustain pressure, like real pressure, and create a lot of chances. I don't think it's anywhere near as likely, maybe, as people making out to be. Don't get me wrong, I'm a Chelsea fan, right? I rate my team, and I think we're going to come in the top 4. I just think at the moment, this isn't even close to the type of fixture that people are making it out to be. Okay. Then you have to consider, what role is Cole Palmer going to play? I probably should have spoken about this at the start, but against these type of sides, where Chelsea are going to build with their traditional 3-2, and the fact that there's no Fofana or Cucurella for this game, by the way, well, does Palmer have to drop deeper? Okay, sure, Enzo could do it as the left 8, basically. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Palmer do it as well if Chelsea is struggling. He's done that in the past. And that just takes him further away from goal. And that always results in a lower likelihood of output. That's something else. Then you look at Newcastle. If this was Newcastle at St. James's Park, I'd be less inclined to think they do this. But look how well Eddie Howe adapted his game plan against Manchester City. He saw what Arteta did, and he blocked City really low. And not with a back 4, but more so with a back 5 in a 5-4-1. And then he transitioned from a man-to-man press high, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if he does something similar against Chelsea. The other thing is he's got such an aggressive, nasty midfielder. And when I say nasty, I mean that in a complimentary manner. In Tonali, Joe Linton, and Bruno Guimaraes. Dual capacity in that midfield is brilliant. They will run their socks off, very aggressive, very physical. And for all of those reasons, I don't think Palmer should necessarily get too much space in these pockets between the lines like he has against other teams. And the shooting opportunities he's had, or the opportunities he's had to play the final pass, or manipulate within or around the box to create something. And for all of those reasons, again, a difficult fixture. We'll come on to United in a second. Arsenal is just the worst fixture in the league to have from an attacking standpoint. I don't need to explain this, right? They're the best defense, and that's pretty much all that needs to be said. Sure, he can perform, especially because he's at home, but I imagine they'll go to Chelsea and actually be fairly defensively minded. No reason they shouldn't be. And Arteta likes his approach in big games. I guess he's a defense first type of man. He definitely is. And then when you consider that is their toughest fixture, there's no way you can see it in a good light, right? Because again, it is all relative. Look, United away, if they play the same way they did against Spurs or even Liverpool to an extent, you look to how much fun Kulusevski had. Palmer will kill them. But you never know what you're going to get with these guys at Old Trafford. And when they're sandwiched by Liverpool away, Newcastle at home, Arsenal at home, I don't necessarily think you have to take the risk of this fixture being a slam dunk that you, I guess, want it to be. And I just think you can fade him. The other thing is we come to the practicality with the premiums and the strategy. What's your realistic route, right? Okay, first of all, you'll have to use 2 to 3 transfers, probably, because at some point the asset or the premium that you're selling in the likes of Saka or Salah, you're probably going to want to get back. So you have to consider the hidden cost of that, and also the opportunity cost of not using it elsewhere. Because there's no reason you can't lose points on this transfer and not capitalize on opportunities elsewhere. Okay, even Foden in the short term, which we're going to come on to in the very short term. So to conclude, yes, what a brilliant player who seems to be at the peak of his powers and is continually getting better. But with all of the reasons listed, predominantly the fixture analysis and the practicality with the premiums, I think it's very difficult to justify, and I just really wouldn't be going to buy him now. Okay, maybe if he does really well against Liverpool, and not only in terms of the returns he gets, but in terms of the performance, okay, then we can talk about it. And to be honest, I don't think that Chelsea are going to go there and perform particularly badly. I don't think we're going to win. I think we're going to lose, but nonetheless, I still think it'll be okay. But I just don't see how you can justify it this week. Right, probably coming to my favorite part of the video now. This isn't, by the way, some rubbish that like, oh, I might captain Salah and then I captain Haaland in the end. Whether I captain Haaland in the end is completely irrelevant because I am genuinely really considering Mohamed Salah for the captaincy for the second time in 3 weeks, and I think the third time in 4 weeks. Right. I went and watched some Wolves footage before this, and what I realized was it wasn't that bad. I think it could have been better in a few elements. One, they have quite a aggressive approach defensively. And I just don't think they need to be when they have such good athletes. So they have good athletes in the middle, for example, Lamina. And the other thing about having an aggressive defensive approach is it often leaves your fullbacks 1v1. You saw that against Brentford, for example. Like Aït-Nouri and Semedo got isolated quite a bit. And I don't think that's the most intelligent thing for them to do, considering that neither of them, respectfully, a great 1v1 in a defensive manner. Okay. I wonder if Gary O'Neill could learn from Eddie Howe that if you play like this against City, because if they use a usual game model, I think they'll get hurt really badly because there's too much space. You can transition on them. And the other big thing is, you know how I mentioned their style of defense is very aggressive? You can see players jump in ways that they wouldn't necessarily do in other teams, right? They're not as interested in blocking passing lanes as they are to maybe going man to man at times and really just trying to win back the ball and engage in some form of duel. If they do that against City, with the fact that City are probably the best side at popping it around with their ball retention, how well coached they are, they will exploit that. They will get players in those pockets of space between the lines and they will find them. And those pockets of space will be occupied by the likes of Bernardo Silva, by the likes of Phil Foden, and they will hurt you. Okay. And for those reasons, if he uses his usual game model, for example, with Haaland, right, the main thing being the transitions and the spacing behind that he could have, yeah, and especially given the fact that like when they go so high and they are quite aggressive and you play through them, you can find yourselves in isolated situations as a unit, which Haaland will really, really exploit. And he's probably one of the best, if not the best player on the planet to do that. So for all of those reasons, if he employs his usual style, I think they're in big trouble. However, my hope, and I was hoping that for something somewhat similar in the Arsenal Southampton game, and I got it. I was hoping for something similar in the Newcastle Manchester City game from a coaching standpoint, and I got it because that relates to my captaincies. And I'm hoping again that Gary O'Neill just shuts up shop a little bit. He goes a little bit deeper. He doesn't have as much space in between the lines, and he does that basically by not being so instructing his players not to be so aggressive and willing to block passing lanes and just shuttle as a block as opposed to engaging. And I think if he does that, genuinely, it could be pretty difficult because it's the first game after the international break. Like I said, Wolves have a lot of good athletes, and therefore they can make the game in a different way quite aggressive and somewhat difficult for City. The other thing, it's away, it's televised, and I think these things make a difference because the crowd will definitely be up for it. The other thing is that I think Wolves are going to score. And with that in mind, especially if it's at 1-1 and at 50, 60 minutes, you can imagine Wolves maybe won't go for the win in their usual style, but they'll maybe shut up shop a little bit. Maybe they get an early goal and decide to do that. And just in general, City have to force it a little bit more. And I find that when City force it a little bit more, when De Bruyne isn't on the pitch, it's a lot of ball striking, leveraging ball striking from outside the box. And that will be, again, Foden territory because he loves to shoot from there. And I think maybe Haaland receives slightly less and is slightly crowded. The other thing is, if their centre-backs are fairly physical, and, you know, if Lamina can help in some capacity, some very weird capacity with that against Haaland, that's another thing. Look, there are obviously all the obvious positives. And again, I'm not trying to disregard that for a single second. All you have to do is read it. And I literally said they're probably toast. And I started with that analysis as well, right? And I think, therefore, Haaland genuinely, last time I probably gave him a seeding of a brace. This time, I'm more than happy to give him like a 16-point seeding for like 2 goals and an assist. But I also think that the downside for him personally is there to an extent with all the variables mentioned. Obviously, again, that it is a wish and a hope that Gary O'Neill employs this. But I don't think it's too unlikely that he does. Right, now let's talk about Mohamed Salah. Okay, so this is a lot of theory as well because these two sides have never played each other. They both got new managers. They've both got new systems. There have been new acquisitions to the side, etc., right? So I really have absolutely nothing to go off apart from theory and what I've seen so far. So give me a little leeway. 2 of Chelsea's back 4 is suspended. I think it's a pretty big deal because when you go to Anfield, the last thing you want is chaos in any form. So, and having half your defense out is quite unsettling, right? Cucurella and Fofana both won't be there. And bear in mind, that's down Salah's side. Now, if Vega plays, that's someone who is physically very, very capable. And he could play at left back. He's played pretty much everywhere so far. He could play at left back and he could give Salah a tough time, especially in terms of the physical sense. However, Salah is pretty capable of managing anyone in that capacity just because he's so intelligent in the way he uses his body and very strong. And whilst Vega, I really like him, and he's probably been our signing of the season so far. How does he cope against the best right wing in the world from a positional sense and a game sense perspective? that is an entirely different thing itself. So that's something. The other thing is, in terms of the overall dynamic of the game and Liverpool attacking, are Chelsea's eights a little bit exploitable? I think maybe, yeah, because Enzo is not a supreme athlete, right? He's not, for example, a Vega or even close. And I think with the game model Liverpool employ, and given that you expect some tempo to at least arrive in the game at some point, I wouldn't be surprised if it's slow, given the way that Chelsea like to build and Liverpool are building at the moment. But I do think at some point the game will quicken up a bit and it will transition closer to a basketball game, if not even close. And there, I think our eights are in trouble a little bit because Palmer and Enzo aren't the greatest off the ball. So that's something to consider, just in terms of Salah being fed with the volume of chances. The other thing is Chelsea building in a fairly narrow-ish 3-2. And with that, high turners over the pitch. Salah doesn't need to be too wide. And this was something I spoke about with Saka against Southampton, albeit in a completely different manner. Because Southampton do build with a usual back four, but it's a very possession-based game model. Therefore, Salah's usual responsibility of tracking whoever is down that flank, or at least blocking them in some capacity, isn't really there to the extent. And I think with Liverpool probably employing a similar type of press to the one they did against United, where as opposed to pressing the back three, they'll look to really jump the pivot, especially with the way that Liverpool press and Chelsea build. I think we could see that being successful at times and those high turnovers. And then just in general, right, like I mentioned with Vega, could he get caught out positionally against the best right winger in the world? Salah has been the best big game, especially like against the big six, the best big six player we've maybe seen for a long, long time, if not ever. All you have to do is look at the records. How do I think he could do individually, and how do I think he will arrive at points to do a similar type of analysis to the one that we had for Saka, which was successful? Well, mainly I think that Chelsea could be exploited with their narrow 3-2 build-up if Liverpool are successful with their press of pouncing on the pivot, similar to how they were against United to an extent. I think from open play as well, he will be offered a greater volume of situations than he was against the likes of Palace, because Chelsea won't be as deep. There'll be more space to exploit. Palmer and Enzo aren't brilliant off the ball. And I think essentially with your midfield being Palmer, Enzo, Caicedo, although it will line up slightly differently to a traditional 4-3-3 type of midfield, that is not the best. Like, obviously, I think Caicedo has been brilliant so far, but I think that is something which Liverpool can exploit and therefore get a lot of chances in the game as a result. And for all of those reasons, alongside the big thing of upside exposure, downside protection, I'm not too far off taking the risk yet again. Because, like I say, that most people who we're competing against, the engaged managers, they really don't own Salah. Okay, they sold him on Wildcard 6, and they have Palmer anyway because they sold Salah recently. So the upside is huge. And the other thing, especially like, look, everyone's teams will be different. But you look at my team, there's no Mbeumo. So when I was calculating the Salah captaincy in game week 6, I was like, okay, it's Salah captain versus Mbeumo and Haaland. This week, it's the same thing. And I don't fancy Mbeumo at Old Trafford. I actually think it's quite a tough fixture for him, and an underrated one in terms of how difficult it actually is. And for all of those reasons, with the upside being even bigger than it was last week, and I would say even bigger than it was in game week 6. The downside I would also say is bigger because I expect Haaland to do. This is a much better game than Fulham or Newcastle was. I completely appreciate that, but in a good position, it's working so far. The upside still won't be too bad, right? Like, even if Salah gets an assist, which is fair to give him, and I'll just give him 5 points, and Haaland does end up getting 16. Okay, I lose 11 points, which is a fairly big deal, but it's not the end of the world. Whereas if I think Mbeumo blanks, which I actually think he does, and I give Haaland even like 7, and I think Salah maybe hauls and gets around like a 28-30, okay, we're in really, really good profit territory there at 19 points. And I don't think that's the most unrealistic thing. All I'm asking for is Haaland to get 7 points or under, which is I'm still giving him a goal and a bonus. And Mbeumo to blank, which I think at Old Trafford is fair. And then Salah to get a goal and assist, which I think, given all the variables, again, is pretty fair. Obviously, that's more on the bullish side and the optimistic side. But I don't think it's out of the question. We will revisit this, of course, in the team selection and the solving your problems video. But I am closer to it than you may think. Right, we will touch on Liverpool again in this section. But before we do that, we must talk about Wolves. I've talked about this defensive theory many a time. I'm going to allude to it again at the end of the section. But Ryan Ait-Nouri is an epitomization of that. At 4-4, with that fixture on, and his quality in the final third, thus being able to generate attacking returns, What a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant pick, in my opinion. And look, the Brighton away one isn't great, I don't think, for his clean sheet prospects, because even though they're unlikely to keep a high volume of clean sheets, they're still the better games for it, and it's not like they're incapable of doing so. So he can still rack up some clean sheets as well. It's not just attacking points as a route to points, but he is so good there compared to so many others. And at 4-4, I really, really like him, because sure, you can look at the likes of Leif Davis, but I definitely back Wolves to keep a clean sheet over Ipswich. Even with the results so far, you can't forget how hard of a fixture run they've had. Thankfully for them, it's ending against Manchester City. And then Matthias Cunha is a player who I think is ready for a Champions League squad in the top four, at least. I say squad because I don't think you necessarily have to start him every week. And it probably wouldn't work in terms of the fee because it's too high for a squad player. But I am such a big fan. You want him to play left wing, you want him to play at 9, you want him to play second striker, you want him to be a carrier in this hybrid type of 8 role. He's so physical, he'll work like a dog for you off the ball, brilliant technician, elite carrier, as I mentioned. And he suits the philosophical shifts to a transition-based football world. All of that, he ticks so many boxes. And for those reasons, because he doesn't play for a top 6 club, I wanted to ensure that you understood how good of a player he is, because he genuinely could be a set and forget player on set pieces, on penalties, 90 minutes, really high level of quality. Honestly, I'm thinking of making some very interesting transfers to facilitate him in my team should Calvert-Lewin keep failing. So that is how highly I rate him. I just wanted to talk about Liverpool because there are 4 options that are being spoken about, or 3 quite a bit, and then 1 I think we need to touch on. The first being Kelleher, and as I say there, I think a little bit of a Trojan horse and therefore a trap, because you're paying 4.4 million with a guy with a very short lifespan in FPL this particular season, because it's not like Alisson's out for months. He should be back after the next international break. Okay, fine, maybe even get 5-6 games out of him. But the 5-6 games aren't even good, right, from a defensive standpoint. Chelsea at home, I expect them to concede. I'm going for like 3-1 in that fixture to Liverpool. Arsenal away, disgusting. Brighton at home, you can score a lot of goals against them, but you know what? They'll probably score some goals against you. Villa, not great. Southampton, you know what? Away to Southampton with the attacking quality they have, even that's not that good. And then the fixture run, I think it's Manchester City after that. So why you would put yourself through that when you know you have to make the transfer down the line and the points aren't really there in the first place? I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if we get 1 haul, because these are the type of games to get 1 haul in, but I just don't think, especially and mainly because of the transfer usage down the line. Therefore, you can understand why I don't really like Trent Alexander-Arnold either. However, I think similar to Diaz, it's actually pretty complicated because look, I've already talked about why I don't like him from a defensive standpoint, similar to the reasons that Ella had. I think the fixtures are very difficult. And in terms of attacking output, as you can see in the results so far this season, he isn't getting into those advanced wide zones enough to be the assist. He can be the assister of the assister, but I think actually generating assists is slightly more difficult for him this year, given the role. And as a result, when you're paying 7.1 million, I think you have to be constantly reassessing this, right? And for me, therefore, in an optimal squad, I don't even think he's that close to getting in, honestly. I think he could be fairly far down in the defensive pecking order, relatively speaking, 100th. And the reason I say he's not necessarily so, even though I don't like him, is there's other priorities that you could have in your team, right? There could be other big issues you have in your team. And this isn't a guy who is a big issue. I just don't think it's the most efficient allocation of 7.1 million. And Chelsea at home is the worst fixture in the world for him. There's still attacking returns to be had in pretty much any game, right? But I think if your team is in a really settled state and you look to continually optimize it, which could be when you have an opportunity like this, I think selling him and facilitating a premium or an upgrade, at least in the midfield and forward line, and adopting the cheaper defensive strategy, Gabriel aside, is fairly intelligent, in my opinion. I say Diaz is pretty complicated, right? Because he has a lot of qualities which would say that he should get a decent amount of minutes and have a decent amount of success in the bigger games. He's got a brilliant engine on him, so you want someone who's going to run your socks off, or his socks off, in these big games. He'll give you that. Obviously, his quality as a footballer, his intensity, again, relating to his engine. But then on the flip side, you have an able deputy. And I wonder if you just give Diaz 65, 70 minutes pretty much every big game and then bring in Gakpo. But honestly, I actually think that he's not going to do that. I think you could see Diaz's minutes will reside more around 80 because of how useful of a player and profile he is in these type of games. I also think he's slightly geared towards performing in these big games for reasons that we probably don't need to discuss right now because it's quite a lengthy and theoretical discussion. Anyway, so for those reasons, I don't actually think I'd be selling him. I think I'd give him the Chelsea game, see how it is. And you know what? Arsenal away is actually such a nice exit point, because if he's not looking that good, you have the perfect excuse to sell him, because you can just be like, oh, look, I've got the hardest fixture on the calendar. I'm not sure if Arsenal actually coming to you could be worse from a defensive standpoint. But anyway, so I would actually hold him this week, and then I think you can reassess after. Game week 10 to 12 for Salah is really nice. I spoke about this in one of my videos previously, but that run of Brighton at home, Villa at home, Southampton away, from a stylistic perspective, is really nice for him. I like the Chelsea fixture this week as well in game week 8. Obviously, Arsenal isn't great, but I do think he could exploit Calafiori to an extent, especially given Calafiori is allowed to wander. And we're actually going to come on to him. For all of those reasons, I would be giving him more consideration than others are doing so. I don't think it just has to be Palmer. I know obviously Salah's very expensive, but with the upside being there, especially if you're looking to captain him this week, I'm looking to captain him in 10 as well. I do think it's a hidden opportunity of sorts. And again, I go back to my theory that I had at the start of the season on defenders. Gabriel aside, and Gvardiol maybe for a couple of weeks, but that's about it. Maybe like 3 or 4. We'll see how he pans out. I don't think that investing a lot of money in the likes of Trent and having like a triple premium defensive structure in Gvardiol, Porro, Trent, Gabriel, whoever you choose out of those, Robbo, whoever 3 you choose, is optimal. I think, especially given the changes to the bonus point structure, given the philosophical change in the Premier League in terms of managers, it's just better to have the attacking assets and have your money there as well, because that's where the profit is to be made, a bit like equities versus crypto. But anyway, especially considering the structure of teams now, not just in terms of the defensive structure, but how that translates to the rest in terms of how you want at least 1, if not 2 cheap midfielders to facilitate big premiums as opposed to a spread of like 3 7.5s. I think it's all the more reason to relinquish some of these premium defensive assets. And I think that's why another reason why I like selling Trent, not just so much in isolation, but also in terms of a more relative sense. Foden, I think, has really, really, really good upside in this Wolves fixture, because if they don't employ a different system, then he will be the one who I think will be found in the pockets a lot, and I think he could really, really hurt them, not just through goals in terms of his high volume shooting and brilliant ball striking, but also feeding hard and generating assists for himself in that manner. Even cutbacks from the wingers, I think that's something we could see as well, especially if it's more open into the likes of Foden. I remember he scored a goal in the Champions League, kind of similar to that. However, De Bruyne is back, and he'll probably be on the bench for Wolves, because why would you start him, right, when he's been out for so long? Well, not that long, you know what I mean? And then Southampton at home is probably a nice game to reintegrate him, especially because now he would have had a lot of training time, some minutes under his belt. And you're gambling, right? Even if De Bruyne doesn't start, maybe Foden gets the hook early. And I don't think he's going to play them together. I don't think he liked playing them together in the first place last season. I think it was more so out of force, given how well Foden was playing and how things in general weren't really clicking. But without Rodri now, I would be surprised if he played them both together. I think he likes having one of the more reserved or defensively orientated 8s. So for that reason, I'd be worried about his expected minutes. But if you fancy him to start Southampton, short term, really nice upside. Trouble with Arsenal, because there are 3 genuine differentials. The one that's not mentioned on screen is Martinelli. I do think he's the worst out of 3 because Sterling will eat into his minutes. But with the left-hand side dynamics being optimized better for him, I think the levels of output are starting to return to what they were about 2 seasons ago. So you could have a punt there. You could have Trossard as well, who I prefer because he's cheaper. I think you'll get better minutes out of him. I know Jesus started in the game against Southampton, but I don't think that's going to become a regular occurrence, especially with the fixtures that Arsenal have. So for all of those reasons, and the fact that he's playing this hybrid 8, almost somewhat second striker role, he's got a decent amount of positional freedom, and the quality and the fact that he's just got goals in him, I think could be a pretty decent reason to go for someone like him as a differential. Calafiori is one I like. If you are looking to maybe go for a double premium structure at the back, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world. I think 3 is really overdoing it. 2 is potentially justifiable. Then Calafiori, with the role he's playing, the fact that he wanders and stations himself so far into the opposition's block, let's say, in that left half space, in the central areas, with the ball striking he's got outside the box, with the technical quality he's got to assist, somewhat similar to Gvardiol, actually. I think he's Arteta's found his Gvardiol to some extent. And then the threat from set pieces as well, on top of the fact that they're the best set piece taking team. I think it could be a really nice differential. And then just to touch on the cheap mids, we've talked a lot about Semenyo on this channel already, so I'm not going to do so again. I would say, though, it's more of a strategy and structuring one as opposed to a footballing one, because similar to Trent, okay, yeah, I think it's ideal to sell him given the next 3, but it's not the end of the world if you have to keep him because he can, of course, still return, especially given the Arsenal and City games are at home and the Villa game is the one that's away. I really like ESR still. I've spoken about in my last video how I was impressed with Fulham. I continue to be so given that nothing's changed. I would rather buy him than sell him if I had a choice. So that pretty much sums up where I'm at. I don't really understand why you'd sell him. It was something I predicted that he could potentially get benched away at Manchester City, but I don't think there's any reason to bench him in the games that are up and coming. And then McNeil, at his price, in his role, with the fixture on, and with his level of quality, I think he's more likely to be good than bad for you. And a fantastic facilitator as well. So I quite like him. And I would probably put him maybe a touch above ESR due to the evergreen fixtures on the FDR. But I do think ESRs are slightly under it. Just to put that out there. But yeah, both very, very good, and I'm bullish on both. Now, before we get on to the last section, I did feel like I was potentially missing something, a talking point that I hadn't quite covered. So if you do think so, please do leave it in the comments. I will be more than happy to cover that in one of the videos later this week. Someone asked me this, and a few people have asked me this, the DM, so I thought I'd talk about it here. I'm pretty adamant that 3-mium is better than 2-mium. And for those of you that don't know what that means, essentially 3 premiums better than 2 premium structures. I don't think you can realistically have Palmer, Salah, and Holland. I think Saka has to be included if it is 3-mium. But the upside that you're getting from them compared to the rest of the field with the way those 4 are playing, I think it's worth it, especially when the cheap enabling options are there and they're good. They're damn good. And there's a high volume of them. So you have pivot points and realistic, good exit routes. The mass usage of Wildcard 6 was to target a fixture swing, albeit one on the slightly smaller side. However, Game Week 12 is bigger. The likes of Watkins, Gordon, Mitoma, and Semenyo are all players who will likely become options again because Newcastle, Brighton, Aston Villa, and Bournemouth are all going to become better options or assets from their teams because the fixtures turn. That is not to mention the fact that Cole Palmer, after his bad run, then has a very good run, and Arsenal are a side who swing in 12 as well. So, in terms of strategy, could you just hold your Arsenal assets, given they have displayed the ability to be very, very competent in big games, particularly what I would deem to be the optimal trio in Gabriel, the biggest set-piece threat in arguably the world, given he's the biggest boss threat for the best set-piece taking team in the world, and the fact that he plays for the best defensive team in the country. Saka and Havertz, who, especially in the big games, take a lot of the attacking responsibility, and a lot goes through them, and you will have value stored in them, and they're in good form. And in terms of stylistic suitability, I'd say the Chelsea one isn't too bad. I'd say the Liverpool one isn't too bad. I'm not a massive fan of the Newcastle one, or the Bournemouth will be interesting. I'm not a massive fan of the Newcastle one, but I think the other two will be okay. And for all of those reasons, do you need to sell them, or can you plan for them? These are all things to consider, and I just wanted to give a slight strategic overview of Game Week 12, what to expect, and to make sure that you are at least planning for it. And potentially, could you go against Erling Haaland? Now, that's something that people are considering in 12. I'm not currently on that strategy, but if you have a wild card, this could be a decent time to play it and go after those opportunities. And I would just say, think about these, have these in the back of your mind, because they will come around quicker than you think, and you will want your team to be in an optimal position to exploit it, because this is where a lot of upside is, as opposed to maybe 8, 9, 10, 11. Obviously, points to be had, but you know what. And lastly, I would encourage you to watch the first 8-minute segment of my last video, where we talked a lot more about the mental, strategic, psychological side of the game. And I think that could really help you going forward. And there's about 6, 7, 8 points covered there, which I think could really help you, as I said. So please do consider watching that. I do think it's for your benefit. And that is all she wrote. I hope you enjoyed the new graphics. I hope you enjoyed the video, and welcome back for FP. As you can see, we've had a very good start to the season. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure to do so. And I shall see you tomorrow for my team selection, where I guess we'll find out if I'm captaining Salah or Haaland. See you then. Goodbye.